Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this special episode, I'm exploring a very simple question. How can organisations get the best out of the humans they employ and empower them to deliver the desired objectives? Now, normally when I focus on human risk, it tends to be from a slightly negative perspective. How do we stop bad outcomes? But there's the flip side, what I like to talk about as human reward, which is how do we get the best out of them? And to help me answer that question, I'm speaking to Sarah Abramson, and she's head of marketing at Acteon, a communication and learning agency in Cambridge in the UK. Now, I came across Acteon last year after they approached me to be the keynote speaker at their annual event called, appropriately enough, Speak to the Human. I had such a brilliant time and met so many amazing people, some of whom have been guests on the show before. There are links to those in the show notes. I did what keynote speakers very rarely do, which was stick around for the rest of the day after I'd done my presentation. And what's more, I'm going back to this year's event as an attendee. Now, since Speak to the Human is taking place this week, and it's a very small invite-only event, you can't buy tickets, there's no recording or live stream, I thought I'd ask Sarah, as organiser of the event, to join me on a special episode of the show to share some of the magic that grabbed my attention. In our discussion, we talk about Speak to the Human, how Sarah goes about curating it, and some of the really unusual elements she incorporates to make it less of a conference and more of a gathering of interesting people. I think what she has to say is a fascinating blueprint for how we can think about running really successful, engaging live events in a post-pandemic world. Before we get to that, though, Sarah talks about the work that Acteon does. You'll hear some fascinating case studies of human risk-related problems being solved in really creative ways. She also tells me about the importance of understanding human behaviour, not the theory of what people do, but the realities of what they actually do, how storytelling can help effective communication, and how to create a sense of belonging and connection within organisations. And we'll also hear about Sarah's own passion for marathon running and coaching, exploring the parallels between athletic training that seeks to get the best out of individual runners, getting the best out of employees at work. This was such a lot of fun to record, and I think you're going to really like this. So whether you're attending the Speak to the Human event later this week, in which case see you there, or this is the first you've ever heard of it, please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Sarah Abramson on Speaking to the Human. Sarah, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's such a pleasure to have you here, and you and I know each other, but some of my listeners might not have come across you, so why don't you tell them about yourself?
Sure. Okay, well, I am head of marketing at Acteon, which is a company based in Cambridge. We are a communication and learning agency. I'll talk in a bit about the types of work that we do, which is really fascinating and varied. So I've been at Acteon for just over 4 years. I've got a background in marketing, communications, really varied stuff. I've run my own businesses, different ventures for about 10 years. And something that I hope we'll get to talk about as well is that I'm a marathon athlete and coach, which I think is a really interesting window into human risk, behaviour, all kinds of different aspects of that too.
Love it. Wow. And of course, the pun fully intended on running in terms of businesses and what you do. But we'll come on to that. But why don't we start? Tell people a little bit about Acteon and the sort of work that you do, because I think it's fascinating. Just give us a sense of what that involves.
Yeah, so do I. And actually, I've been so lucky to find this job. I've got fantastic, brilliant colleagues who are super creative and interesting to work with. But yes, the work that we do, we actually do quite a few varied projects. We have quite a big team that works in the pharmaceutical sector. But the bit that I think is most relevant for your listeners is the work that we do kind of around helping our clients to translate strategy, the sort of boardroom strategies that companies have, into what does that mean for the actions that people need to take? And how do you help employees to take those actions? So I think that the most helpful place to start with that is by reminding ourselves that organisations are fundamentally collections of humans, and the success or failure of any strategy that a company comes up with is entirely reliant on the choices, the actions, the behaviours that those humans choose to take on any given day. So how do we help and support and influence them to do the things that are helpful to them and to their organisation? The way we do that is to really try and focus on actions, which is often surprisingly difficult for particularly leaders and boardroom level people to get their heads around. we talk about moments that matter. So we are trying to identify which are the actions and the moments that have a disproportionate effect on whether a strategy is successfully implemented. How do we know what those things are? And what's really interesting, so let's take an example like in compliance. Let's think about health and safety. We've worked with care homes on fire safety. And what we might find is that, obviously care homes have got a really significant duty to meet compliance requirements. There's going to be very carefully regulated policies that they need to meet. And it's, of course, the duty of the board and the managers and everybody to make sure that those standards are met. But what you typically find is that is conveyed in the form of, we have asked everyone to complete this training course. Everyone's done the e-learning module. We're all happy. Everybody knows what's in the policy. Brilliant. Well, is it? Actually, what are the particular things that you need people to do? The action that you need people to take is not to read the policy. It's that, for example, we know that closing fire doors is going to reduce the spread of a fire in a care home or anywhere. So we need people to close the doors. So how are we going to focus attention on helping people to remember to close the doors? They've probably propped them open for all sorts of reasons. They've carried a chair from one room to another and then they've left it open and whatever. There's probably good reasons why that happened. But we need people to understand that particular action is going to have a significant and disproportionate difference on the outcome. Some examples, I think, are less tangible than that, but equally interesting to look at. So, it might be around, how do we continue to build a really positive, inclusive culture now that we've got people working remotely? So that might be that the boardroom strategy is around, developing culture. How are we doing that? I don't know about you, but I'm finding companies are coming up with all kinds of different attitudes about hybrid working at the moment. And it's kind of really interesting to see that evolve. But regardless of where they're landing at the moment, there's certainly a need to think about, how do we carry through our cultural value in an increasingly remote or hybrid world? So it might be that they've said, okay, so hybrid meetings need to still be good quality and we need them to be inclusive. And they think that's an action.
Right.
But that's not an action. So what we say is, well, what's that look like? What is the thing that people need to do to make that happen? So a really good example of bringing that to life would be, hey, does it make a difference when everyone in this meeting has their webcam on? And we find that, it does. If people can see each other and they feel connected and they feel like they're actually having a conversation in the room, especially if it's hybrid and some people are in a room. But either way, if you've got some people who are remote or everyone who's remote, if you can see each other, it feels better. You've got a more intimate human connection. Now, there may be good reasons why, in some cases, you don't want to mandate that people have their webcams on, because there may be a personal reason going on. But if there's a general expectation that this is the way that we work, that's really helpful. That has surfaced a particular moment that matters is switching your webcam on. So this is the kind of thing we're talking about. And we talk about shape the moments that matter, which is identify which of those things, which of those actions have a disproportionate effect on helping to deliver a strategy, and then look at how you influence them. We've got an approach that's well-founded in behavioural science and looks at 3 drivers of human behaviour. So those are capability, motivation, and opportunity. So capability, do I have the skills and the knowledge that I need in order to take the action that you're asking me to take? So that's kind of traditionally the territory of learning and development. It might be training, it might be an e-learning course. These things do still matter. People need to have developed the skills and be supported to develop the skills in order to do the thing they're being asked to do. But there's also motivation. So are you engaging people? Are you helping them to understand their role, why what they're doing matters, and how this kind of relates to their sort of broader experience at work? Why, a particular action is going to help them, help their team, help their organization, help the experience of working together to be better, and have you communicated and connected with that? That's a really fascinating area. Obviously, it touches on communication, But yeah, really, really, really interesting area of sort of psychology, but also brilliant area for campaigning, where you want to be doing brilliantly engaging stuff that's bringing people on board. And then the third driver is opportunity, which is an interesting one because that is often feels less directly connected with the individual and is often more about what's the environment that they're working in. Have they got the tools, the time, the resources, the support in order to help them to do the thing that you're asking them to do? So, is their manager supporting them? Have they got the time? Have they got a system or a process? So yeah, that's kind of broadly how we think about it.
Wow. And then there's an interesting behavioral science framework called COM-B that covers
Yes.
these things. I'll put a link to that in the show notes for anybody who wants to dive in more. So this is, as you say, based on science. And is this, in an ideal world, right, people would come to you maybe even before formulating the objective, right? Because you might come up with something that sounds great, but it just is never going to happen, right? It's unrealistic. I presume you've got, there'll be certain clients where that's the case, right? Where you're involved in it. But others, it'll be, we've tried to make something happen and it is not functioning the way we'd expect it. So help us to make that happen. I presume it's all of those things, but ideally you'd be involved in that design before the thing is even uttered or printed or whatever. It's kind of like, is this actually, can we actually make this happen? Or is there so think about what you're demanding or requiring or asking, whatever phrase you want to use, before you do that. And I presume you sit across that spectrum of
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that that's something we've worked on really hard over the last sort of 4 or 5 years is kind of, I think previously people had formulated a brief and we were known for being kind of super creative people who would do a kind of creative centerpiece, a video or a song or something that would be at the heart of a campaign. And those are great. We love working on those. But it's much better if people come to us before that, before they have decided on what the thing is that they need to do, so that we can really dig into what's going on. What are the behaviors that you're looking at? Why are people currently not doing those things? What's the gap? And how are you going to close that gap? And ideally, we like to spend time going beyond the initial conversation, going beyond the kind of leaders or the commissioners and talking to people, the employees who are being asked to take the actions. That may be frontline staff, or it may be, maybe team leaders, it may be whoever it is that you're trying to reach, and trying to understand what it is that affects their decision. But yeah, absolutely. We certainly have worked on projects where there's a challenge that could be cultural. People will come to us. There's a really nice example of a project that we've done with Channel 4. And for listeners who aren't familiar with Channel 4, that's a broadcaster in the UK that's got an extremely interesting business model. So it's a publicly owned broadcaster, but not publicly funded. So it was set up in the 80s as publicly owned, but funded by advertising. And from the beginning, it's had a culture of kind of risk taking and being a bit different, a bit edgy, which is fantastic. I'm sure, Christian, you're very familiar with some brilliant programming that's come out of it that, pushes the boundaries. And it's very cool. It's a cool place to work, but it definitely has that interesting kind of, we enjoy creative risks here. And that means that when they try to roll out a code of conduct, they're doing it almost against a culture where, that's going to be a comfortable fit. So you've asked people to join a culture where you want to push boundaries, and then you're saying, but here are all the rules that we want you to follow. Yeah, not ideal. So how do you get that across? And so we worked with them on a really interesting project to help them launch a code of conduct in a way that was going to help them to connect the code with their culture. So this is about, instead of here are all the rules, this is about here are the things we need to do in order to function effectively to allow us to take those risks. So it's about learning to take risks. It's about giving us a safe space because we've met the requirements. We are doing the things that we need to do to look after each other, so that then we can carry on. We can continue to operate. We have met the compliance requirements, and this means that we can continue to function and we can continue safely to push those boundaries without being taken off the air. The campaign that we worked with them on really focused on very specific message about how do you use this. So we don't want people to be landed with a huge code where they're just not going to read it. They're not interested. They're already a bit like bored with the whole idea of policies. How do you turn that into an action? How do you turn a code of conduct into an action? So we came up with a campaign which kind of riffed off you remember the last leg? This was, again, for listeners who may not be familiar, this was a program that was launched around the time of the London Paralympics, actually, called The Last Leg. And they focused on Paralympics and particularly asking questions that people had previously thought might be uncomfortable to ask about athletes with disabilities, or about, the Paralympics, opening up conversations that may have felt uncomfortable before that and making them okay. And the question, their hashtag that they had on then Twitter was, is it okay? So we took, because that's a Channel 4 program, we took that hashtag, is it okay, and applied it to the code of conduct. So as the action, we're asking people to stop and ask the question, is it okay? And then we're giving them 4 checks. How do I know it's okay? So it's a very specific, kind of tangible way of turning a code of conduct into something that is memorable, a single action. And we built a creative campaign around that looked fun and made use of the amazing, the last leg, but also amazing other footage that we could tap into from Channel 4, who were obviously a fun client to work with.
And so this is what I love about what you're doing, is this is looking at the real world. So what I describe as, not the way we would like people to behave, but recognizes the way they're likely to behave. And so you're sitting there saying, okay, this isn't just a sort of command and control North Korean, we're going to tell you to do it and you will do it. That doesn't work. We know that. And particularly in a creative environment, that's not going to work. But I guess the second thing is, and I love that example of a code of conduct, because we see this quite often where codes of conduct or training sort of deals with hypotheticals that are so bloody obvious that you don't need help. Sort of, what do you do in these extreme circumstances? Nobody needs help with that. It's kind of like the do not murder type school of training, right? Nobody needs to be told that. And if they do, you've got much bigger problems than the code. So what you're doing here is really getting into that gray area of saying, let's recognize the realities of the relationship between the employer and the employee.
Yeah.
And particularly, I guess, where you've got freelancers and things like that, makes it even more complicated. But that's messy, because it's not a straightforward case of that people will automatically do what they're told. And then the second thing is the realities of the world that people are in, the sorts of challenges that they're going to be facing don't neatly codify themselves. We don't need help spotting obvious things. It's stuff that we might not have thought of, or things where actually in the heat of the moment, we might tend to do things that perhaps we shouldn't if we had a chance to thought about them. So you're recognizing I guess the fact the world's not black and white. It's like those square nuances. And how do we deliver something that works with that, rather than something that just sort of theoretically ticks the box?
Yeah, completely. And I think getting under the skin of what's really going on is crucial, obviously, and it's not always easy to get at. So spending a little bit of time really understanding what the challenge looks like, and why are people not already doing the thing that would essentially be helpful to them. What's going on there? What's that all about? And I think, going back to your previous question, I think, the earlier we can engage with trying to understand that, the better, so that we're not already just being asked to meet a brief for an assumed issue, an assumed kind of answer for closing that gap. What we really want to do is try and understand the behaviour in the first place, and what's going on, what's preventing people from doing that. And what's interesting is that it isn't always what executives or even managers think it is. Sometimes it's not even what the people themselves will tell you. We met Christian through the event that I organised called Speak to Human. The year before you came as a speaker, we had a brilliant woman called Becky Rowe, who I should introduce you to because she'd be a fantastic podcast guest. She runs a company called Revealing Reality. And they do, I guess, what you might call behavioural anthropology, where they really spend time kind of embedding in organizations to look at what people are doing. And it isn't what they say they're going to do. If you ask people to fill in a form, or you ask them in a kind of quick question, why do you do this thing? They'll give you quite a quickly formulated but post-rationalized answer to that. Here's what I think people want to hear that sounds reasonable, but it's often not really what's driving the behaviour. And a great example that she has, they do a lot of work with the NHS, and they have the luxury of kind of being embedded for quite a period of time. So they'll do something where they're looking at a particular issue or need, and they'll spend 3 days, 4 days a week in a ward looking at what's going on, for example. And one of the examples that I love from her was about catheters. So the issue is that catheters are not being changed often enough, and that has serious consequences. People get infection, and particularly in a geriatric ward, that's a serious issue. It can be a fatal issue, but it's not happening. The catheters were not being changed often enough. And if you just ask the nursing staff, who are all very competent, they're all motivated to do the best job they can, they're all devoted to the work that they're doing. I say all. I mean, I'm making a generalization. You like to assume it, but I'm sure that's the the top level for most people. But still, they're not doing this thing. And they'll say, oh, well, it was almost the end of my shift, or it had been changed just before I came on, or, I didn't have time. Spending more time looking at what was actually happening, Becky's team found that even nursing staff don't like to touch people's genitals. So that's the reason why the catheters are not being changed. But nursing staff or anybody, they're not going to come up and admit that that was the reason. It's not a comfortable thing to say. And it probably to them feels like they ought to be fine with that kind of thing because that's their profession. But they weren't saying that. So actually uncovering that and understanding it, that's incredibly important. Understanding why people are doing or not doing the thing that you need them to do. It's not just about what they'll tell you. So that's the kind of end where you can really spend time diving into depth. Often in our projects, we can't do that. We have to work at a more surface level. But even so, having an opportunity to go and ask people or observe people, we've done things that we like to call a behavioural safari, where we actually go out and we spend time in shops for a retail client or whatever. One of the recent projects we had where we did manage to get at that was, again, a care home provider. Where they were looking at why attendance levels were too low for their training courses. And interestingly, what the leaders were coming up with were things like, oh, well, maybe the care home managers are not communicating regularly enough about the training course. Maybe people have just forgotten about it. Maybe it's not been put into the rota. These are the things that we think are going on. Or maybe they're short-staffed, to be fair to them, maybe they just couldn't get out that day. All of that is probably true, but there was more going on. And when we had a chance to talk directly with those frontline staff themselves and without managers in the room, so they were safe to say what their real experience was, there were some really interesting things going on. Like, they put this training course in a really grotty building that was on the other side of the city. The transport was really unreliable. I missed the one bus connection, didn't meet another bus connection. And it meant that I was 20 minutes late. Well, there's a rule there where the instructor will not let you in if you're more than 15 minutes late. So I wasn't allowed in. Or I just don't like going to them. They don't even give you tea and coffee. And what was fascinating is that there were a number of things in that category where they were pretty low budget or not mass budget things to remedy. I mean, certainly the tea and coffee, we're talking pounds. But even the venue, it probably would have cost less money to put it into a more convenient venue than the money that they were losing through this non-attendance and consequent impact on compliance because they're not hitting the numbers that the regulator needed to see. So yeah, really interesting ways of just sort of trying to dig into that. What's really going on here?
And I love it when you talk in those terms because intuitively, in our personal lives, we all know these things, right? So we know, for example, if we're asked on a survey, let's take pricing as a silly example, right? How much would you pay for this product? There'll be a little bit of gaming it, go, well, I better not tell them exactly what I'm prepared to pay for it, right? Because they'll rip me off, right? So, or any questions that we get about things, we will present a face to the world that is appropriate, feels logical, right? So in other words, we will lie for good reason, right? So we know that happens in our personal lives. We know that we don't always do the things that we ought to do. Every single one of us, and clearly you don't have this particular issue, given the other bit that you talked about, which we'll come on to talk about. But some of us are a bit lazy, right? So if I've got a choice of going for a run or doing something, I might find a reason not to do it. But if you asked me, of course I'm going to say, well, I do regularly do exercise. And if I'm asked that in a medical environment, I might choose to tell, the classic thing about people reducing the units of alcohol that they drink or saying that they do more exercise. Right? So we all know this. And what I find fascinating is, for some reason, there's a presumption that in a corporate environment, that doesn't apply.
Yeah.
In other words, that these humans that we've hired, well, yeah, I kind of know they do that in their private, but they would never do that in the work environment. And of course we do, because it's the same human brain. So if we know that humans instinctively behave in that way, then it's not really surprising that when we design things based on logic or what we would like to have happen, that it doesn't work. And so what I like about that is we can all point to things that we understand in our own life. We don't have to admit them to anybody else, but we all understand it intuitively. And so it seems to me what you're doing is kind of going, look, if we know these things, let's just go in and be a little bit on it. Let's just kind of open the box a bit and be honest about the realities that are there. And then we can try and solve the problem,
Yeah.
as opposed to sort of wishing it away by, pronouncements or kind of logical solutions that don't recognize the realities of the way humans think.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's very easy for us to forget that we're dealing with humans who are messy, who post-rationalize things, who don't always take the logical approach. And, that's incredible. I think I don't know, it'd be great to get your views on this, but I think we live in a very data-driven world now. And I think that focus on quantitative and evidence-based is very helpful often. And we need technology. We need all of these things. But I think often it means it can be a little bit of a struggle to then place those things into a human context and remember that we still have to empathize with people and normal human behavior and that kind of messiness around it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I was thinking about this so I love talking about anecdata, right? So there's a big focus on data, but we need anecdotes as well. And in primitive analysis, data tells you what's happened. Anecdotes can often tell you why. And so if we look at those two things, and I think sometimes in the temptation with data is to go, okay, we've identified the problem, and typically it'll be the humans aren't doing what we want. They're not following, they're not walking along the path that we need them to walk along. So we're gonna make that happen. And I think if you can get the anecdotes as to why, well, I'm not going to walk the long way around when there's if it's a literal path, or this system's a pain in the neck, so I don't use it.
Yeah.
Right. Or it's about back to your early point, and don't worry, I'm not going to ask you how that problem was solved. But to your point around, I don't like touching genitalia as part
I
of
don't
my
actually
job.
know how the problem is solved.
Right.
Which probably saves both of us from an awkward
Yeah,
conversation.
exactly. But there's a good example, right? We as soon as you get that anecdote that goes, that's the problem.
Yeah.
You suddenly realize why the logical solutions are silly. And so the data will tell you it's not happening.
Yeah.
But you need that anecdote piece, the anecdata, to get those two things together. And I always quote, there's a great Jeff Bezos quote, the Amazon founder, where he talks about the fact that, if the stories and the data don't match up, go get more stories.
Yeah.
Right? Because or more data, right?
Yeah.
Just keep investigating, because those two things need to tie together, because people will share. The other thing I think is interesting is the way you're talking as well. And I love that idea of don't let the managers in the room. But generally speaking, in organizations, someone somewhere will have an idea about how to solve the problem if they were empowered to admit the truth of what's happening, but also given free rein to think creatively about how to solve it.
Mm.
And I think often organizations don't tap into that. And the bit I find really intriguing as you're talking is, I was thinking, we all know this goes on because we have those TV shows where the boss goes undercover boss, or whatever they're called, right? But where they go and they disguise themselves, and then they see what really goes on in their business. And yeah, it's hammed up for TV and all those kinds of things. But the basic construct of the show is you don't know what's going on in reality in your organization, so you need to go find out.
Mm.
And so we love watching that show because there's always these moments of shock. Oh my God, this is much worse than I was expecting. Blah, blah, blah. And it's great television, but we understand that construct is likely to produce some surprises.
Yeah.
And so the bit that astonishes me is, why does it need a TV show to illustrate that point? It's so blindingly obvious. Of course you don't know what's going on in the factory or on the shop floor if you're sat in the boardroom doing board meeting type things. You're never going to have that awareness. And we know that. And so I think what you're doing is kind of closing that gap of, if we really want to solve problems, then we need to get to the bottom of the reality of what's happening.
I think what I love there personally, I think the power of storytelling is massive. And I think as humans, we connect so naturally with stories. We want to have that emotion. We want to see that surprise of the boardroom executive that's gone to the factory floor. Maybe that's funny, maybe it's surprising, whatever it is. But I think the way that we use storytelling and communication and a clear message to connect with people is absolutely fundamental in the sort of human condition. We need stories. They're so much more relatable. They develop our cultures, our sense of belonging. They give us that kind of identity that those shared experiences. And those are the things that help us to remember. They sort of build our belonging and our understanding of the world. That's how we function. And I suppose what I'm trying to get at with that quantitative focus is that I think our use and development of data and technology can be even more powerful if we don't forget that side of ourselves. My previous job before Acteon, I was working at the University of Cambridge as communications manager in the engineering department, which was simultaneously fascinating and hilarious because I'm dealing with brilliant people. These are world leaders. I was in the manufacturing area, and they're doing life-changing stuff. They're doing fantastic work, but there were not many of them that understood how to communicate what they were doing really effectively. Never mind using stories to tell it. Even though that's an area of academia that is particularly closely connected with the business world and industry. Of course it is, it's manufacturing. So they've often got these very close partnerships. But the ability of academics who spent their time with their heads in their numbers and really analysing stuff and being these brilliant analytical thinkers to lift their heads up and go, okay, how do I tell a non-specialist? How do I tell another human about why this matters? Because I really care about it. So many of them were so bad at it. It was hilarious. And I think it was particularly acute in a department where, you've got this imbalance of I'm probably going to get shot for saying this, but really high IQ and often quite low emotional intelligence, EQ.
Right.
So my job was really interesting of being a communications manager and going and saying, in a very annoying and kind of nosy way of saying, yeah, but why? Why does that matter? And can we tell a story about it? And not just, oh, yeah, somebody can use that, but what's the result of that? What's the impact on the world? And look, you're doing really interesting stuff. So let's help people to understand that. And some of them got that quite easily, but there's quite a number that didn't. But yeah, I'm so passionate about the power of storytelling and why it matters. And I get frustrated when I see brilliant work happening from people like that, but that it gets ignored or sidelined or overlooked or just not understood because it's not effectively communicated. And I think that's what I love about marketing. That's what I love about storytelling and communications and all of that stuff. It's if you can find the story, wow, you've got a powerful way of helping people, connecting with people, and all of that.
And then there's two things in what you said that I find fascinating. The first one is we ought to all be good at telling stories, right? Because that's how we learn, that's how things are handed down. But we also know in the 21st century that we can recognize that there are people who have certain skills. So there's some people who are not very good at maths, right? Either because maybe they're dyslexic or just because it's not their thing, or they don't enjoy it. And there are other people that love it, that find it really, really simple, second nature. And so there's no reason why we should expect everybody to be brilliant at storytelling. And so I think, why do we have comms functions? Why do we have specialists to help us communicate? Why do we have spin doctors? Right? It's because we're bridging that gap. And so you wouldn't want to hire scientists at Cambridge University who weren't really good at science, right? I mean, like if we picked, I don't know, Boris Johnson, right? Very good at telling stories. I wouldn't want him anywhere near any kind of engineering or serious project because frankly, that's not his skill set.
I'm not sure I want him near any of my projects.
No, well, this is true. Right? This is true. Right? And so as we look at that, we recognize actually, and that's why he was a disaster as a prime minister, right? Because he's not got the necessary skill sets. And I'd argue that let's get very political now. I'd argue that the current prime minister is very good at maths and the technical stuff, no question. He's crap at communicating. Can't do it. And every time he gets wheeled out, it's like, oh God, this is terrible. Yeah. And so what I think is really interesting here is if we think about the world of getting the best out of people, I think one of the things that's worth recognizing is that there are going to be certain people that are really good at this communication stuff and thinking about humans, right? So we should let them loose on that. And then there's other people that are really good at the sort of, and let's just generalize for the hell of it because it's fun, pointy-headed people who love algorithms and numbers and blah, 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 are really good at that stuff, right? But crap at communicating. And there'll be everything in between.
Yeah.
And so I think this, for me, all this points towards is we should start to recognize, and I think this plays into neurodiversity as well. We can start to recognize what are people good at, what are they crap at, and you can't be good at everything.
Yeah.
So let's start to recognize those things. And so I love this. I almost love the idea that someone in the engineering department has gone, well, we need to have someone help us communicate, right? Because we're not very good at that. And so I think that's
There's
super,
a little
that's
bit of
super interesting.
self-awareness there.
Yeah, it's a bit super true. And then that was the first bit I thought was interesting. And then the second bit I was really intrigued by was the way you described what you did, right? Going around asking questions. In effect, what you're doing is like a small child.
Yeah.
Right. And I say this because I keep reflecting back to how did I get to where I got to? Well, I was that really annoying kid who just like typically in a way that would embarrass the hell out of my parents, but it was always like pointing and generally at people. Oh, why is he wearing that? Right, I'm just curious about the world. I want to have explanations and why. And I wouldn't accept the first level of answer, right? If it didn't seem satisfactory, just keep going. And so I love this idea that in fulfilling that role of getting the story out there, you in a way have to behave like a small child.
Yes.
Right? There's this persistent questioning
Yes.
to get to the bottom. And I don't know why that's not, it's sort of the way you described it, it almost felt like it was a bit naughty, right? Shouldn't really be doing this, whatever. But I think we should be allowing that.
Totally.
And I find it really weird that's kind of the preserve of chill. Well, that's kid, right? Kids are allowed to do that. Now, I'm not suggesting that we walk around and point at people in the street, right? There's a way to do it. But I think that permission to ask questions and to challenge and all those sorts of things that you depicted so nicely, I don't think should be the preserve of just comms people.
No.
One of the problems it seems to me that we have is we don't do enough of that.
Yeah.
We just sort of nod things through, or that's the way they do things, or I have to accept that. And so I love the way you depicted it, because as I was hearing it, I was just imagining this a small child who's been given permission to do an adult role. But there's something in that.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few things in there. But I think sometimes people don't like to be asked too many questions because they're worried about it exposing things that they maybe not comfortable to have exposed. I think we could all do with more comfort in a space for making mistakes and being vulnerable humans and not being perfect. And I think the more we can be comfortable with that and embrace that and encourage it in others and have that, that all important psychological safety that we talk about, the better. And the more space we can allow for asking questions of ourselves and of other people, and for it to be okay for our colleagues and other people to ask questions of us. And if that exposes a space that we lean into that, the better. I want to pick up on what you're saying there about kids, because I was thinking about this before our chat, is that it's so interesting kind of bringing a parental perspective to human risk. And, my goodness, I really feel like we have still got work to do around bringing parents and mums in particular back into the workforce, because you learn so much about human behavior from being a parent. And if you can deal with a belligerent toddler, you're much more likely to be able to deal with engineering academics. Let me promise you. There's a lot of similarity. And I think that's a really interesting area. I'm not obviously just to sort of couch this carefully, I'm not saying that all mums are going to be better managers, but I think that that is often a sideline. We need to be really careful about not sidelining or being punitive about people who have had time out their careers, which I do still think happens, where actually those are people who have probably in themselves developed their own skills and ability in understanding human behavior and how to deal with it. I don't want to sound smug as a parent. I don't want to sound like I've got all the answers. I haven't. But I think, gosh, I've learned so much from being a parent, and also from observing what other parents do and whether it seems to work or not. One of the things that I used to do with my kids to avoid meltdowns when they were toddlers, small children, I hope they're not going to listen to this because they're not going to thank me. They're now 18 and 16, so 15, sorry, was to, instead of saying, right, you need to put your coat on now, we're going out, was to say, would you like this coat or this coat? Or would you like your coat buttoned up or open? So it's giving them a choice. It's not that hard and it doesn't take that much energy. And often it avoids the meltdown. And I think we very frequently forget that children, even very small children, are still humans. They might be little ones, but they're still humans. And I think we kind of have a tendency, there's a social tendency to think that as parents, we ought to be in control. And we try to impose control on our children. And I think one of the things that I've observed is that the stronger a, a hold people try to have on controlling their children, often the more friction they tend to have in those relationships. Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I think that I've learned as I've gone along, I've tried to kind of think very carefully about how I make sure my kids have that sense of agency and have that sense of control. I think there's a really interesting area at the moment that is a hot topic around social media and mobile phone use with kids and teenagers. And, it is a serious issue. And I think we'd all recognize that there's a lot of difficulty that goes with that. But I think often the tendency, which I think is very interesting, is that feeling that as adults, we ought to be trying to control phone use. And actually, if you said to me, Christian, okay, I'm giving you a phone, I'm paying for it. Imagine I'm 14. Imagine I'm 12. I'm giving you a phone, but it's my phone. You're allowed to use it. But I'm I'm in control of it. I'm like, okay, he's giving me a phone, brilliant. I'm going to go off and, now I've got a crush on this boy at school. I'm going to be messaging him and I'm going to be chatting with my friends about it. And then you go, oh, well, that's my phone. So I'm going to now read your messages. I'm mortified and angry, and I feel like you've taken control away from me. And guess what? Our 12-year-olds are still humans, and that's how they think.
Right.
And I think that means that when you then say, oh, I've made a nice evening meal, let's sit down and have a chat, I'm going to be like in a strop and I don't want to have a conversation with you. I think that's often the space that we find ourselves in. It lacks trust and it takes away control. And I've found it's much more effective to have a sit down, sensible conversation with my kids about, look, we understand, and you probably understand better than me, that there are dangers with social media use and that, phones are simultaneously brilliant because you can chat with your friends and during COVID you can stay connected, but there's all these dangers attached to them. So how are we? It's much more powerful if I can help them to be equipped to deal with that in life. And how do I do that? How do I empower them? How do I make them feel trusted and trust themselves, but help them to kind of develop that way of thinking? Like, I can do this. I can take responsibility. So it's really interesting. My daughter came to me. We've got double exams in our house at the moment. So that's starting this week. We've got GCSEs and A levels. It's pretty full on. My daughter came to me last week. She goes, "Oh, Mum, I found this quite cool app. I think it is. That's limits my TikTok use." She's like, "I like TikTok, Mum. It gives me a little break from studying. But it's really addictive. They've designed it to be addictive. It gives you a dopamine hit at the end of every little video. You're on to the next one and you want to keep watching it. And they've made it so it's really hard to stop." So I found this cool app that I can set a time limit and it boots me off for 15 minutes. I'm like, awesome. That's amazing. You've solved a problem yourself. You've recognized it in yourself. It's not been me that's gone, I am in control of your phone and I am going to stop so that you then feel really motivated to work. Because guess what? You're probably not going to feel motivated to work. You're probably just going to be pissed off with your mum. So, it's just a different way of thinking. And I think we can learn a huge amount from how we have those sort of parent-child relationships about human behavior that we can probably apply in all sorts of other ways too.
And I love that because I think that's a really good illustration of she's got to what you consider to be the right answer, right? Which is a bit of self-control around that. The self being critical, I think, in that piece, which I think is interesting because it means you don't, it's intrinsically motivated, right? So it's way more powerful than you telling her because there's no resistance to it, right? Because it's come from within. But the bit that I also like, and if we took that into sort of corporate settings, we'd say, okay, well that's brilliant, right? Because that's one less thing where I might have to impose myself, because there are going to be things where you probably do have to impose yourself, where you probably do have to put limits in place because that intrinsic motivation, they may not realize it, may not have the experience, whatever, right? You're going to have to step in. And so if you can avoid having to do that, you can save those moments for when it's really necessary. And so I look at this in a sort of corporate sense and say, at some point, as an employer, we are going to have to piss our employees off, right? We're going to have to make them do some training that's dull. There's going to be something that will be more awkward because we need them to do it a particular way than they would want to do it themselves, right? We're going to be a pain in the arse. So what we should try to do is recognize when we're doing that, so that we're aware that we're doing it, so that we can try and avoid doing it if we can. But then we can save that for when it's really necessary, when there is no alternative but to be a pain in the arse. And so I love this idea of freeing that up. And if you're alert to that possibility, then you can start to say, of course, that feels like far too much of this, right? Where can we reduce? Where do we really need to get them to do this? How can we? And you're much more conscious about how it feels from their perspective. And so when you're pissing them off, I think then it sends a signal of, okay, they don't do this all the time, but they're clearly doing this for exceptional reasons. I'll go along with it because actually normally they're reasonable people. And so I think that's a really good illustration of saying, okay, that's a compliance lesson in what you've just said, right? However you've done it, you've created a culture in your family where it's the freedom to go and find the initiative and sort of work it out for themselves. And so I think if we can take that as a brilliant example, and I loved your point about, there are lessons that we can take. I mean, it's actually just riffing us aside. I think it's interesting you talk about, maternity or paternity or parental leave. That comes, there's things you learn from that are incredibly valuable. But there are other things you can do that also, and this idea that career breaks are bad. If the career break has involved you sitting on your backside, smoking dope and doing absolutely nothing of any consequence, probably not great. But whether you've gone traveling, or whether you've gone and done a degree, or brought kids up, or whatever it is, right, cooking course, like something that feels irrelevant. And I think we often undervalue these skills, and we sort of go, well, you've been out of work for a while. That means you're less relevant. Now, sure, if there are skills that you need to be bang up to date on something, and if you've been out of it, maybe there's a catch-up period required. But I think the human benefits of other experiences are often underestimated. And there's this kind of like, well, you've been doing something different. That's weird.
Yeah.
And I kind of go, well, like, what could we do with that?
Absolutely.
Right? Let's not look at it negatively and say you've been out of action. Recognizing, as I say, if there's catch up to be done because the world has moved on, or you're not in the habit of doing something. I don't want somebody suddenly handling medical situations where, I did operations 20 years ago, right? I'm not coming back in, right? And then need to refresher, I know what I'm doing, right? That's not what we need. But there may be something in the whatever extracurricular activity, whatever that happens to be, that's useful.
Yeah.
And I think that's often missed.
Yes, definitely. Would you like me to talk about my extracurricular activity?
Yes, exactly. That's you spotted it. Yeah, there we go.
I mean, I do, because I think that it's very connected, obviously, in my identity and the things that I do. But I find all sorts of connections in my professional work and what is effectively semi-professional work as an athletics coach, because they're all about human psychology, and there is so much that's relevant here about trust, control, risk, and understanding how we take really good principles and theory and practice and apply it to an individualized human context. I think as a coach, you build quite intimate relationships that are fascinating on a level where you can't necessarily, what we were talking about earlier with corporate strategies and ways that you need to engage employees. Even in a small organization, you're kind of doing that en masse, and you're having to bunch people together as a kind of way of understanding why people do what they do. I think it's really interesting to look at an individual level. And as an athletics coach, you have that opportunity to really kind of dig in and understand what motivates an individual. And I find the power of personalized coaching, or understanding how to take the principles that I know work, that I'm confident in, but really thinking about how does this fit with this person. That's, I think, the skill of a coach, and really fascinating. So yeah, I mean, I'm a marathon athlete. I do a lot of running myself. I coach. So these are good club runners that I coach and run with myself, from under 2 hours 30 marathon to about 3 hours 30. So if you think of, on average, a marathon runner would be 4:15, 4:30 runner. These are really good athletes. They're not like the elite. So I have quite a big training group at Cambridge and Coleridge. I have 2 training sessions a week. So I'll shape sessions, I'll design sessions that are good for a whole group of athletes, but I also have individual coaching relationships where I'll spend time with different people at different times. The role that I have as a volunteer coach, I can't get into the depths that you would have as an elite coach, where you probably have one, two, or a small group of athletes where you've got really deep relationships and you're doing it professionally and you can spend, 2 or 3 hours a week talking with them, that kind of thing. I don't have that, but I am able to help individuals, design how their training is going to look and think about how that fits best into their life. But I think there's some really interesting stuff with the marathon, which is an acutely difficult, challenging event if you're a club runner that is trying to run it as fast as you can. So that's the difference with these people. These are not people who are just interested in completing the distance. Nothing wrong with that. Fully respect it. It's an amazing challenge. But these are a different type of athlete. They are people who are trying to run it as fast as they can. And they're trying to improve on previous performances. And typically they'll have done several marathons before, and we're kind of we're looking at building one on the next and understanding how to improve from a previous performance. So yeah, the psychology of that is fascinating, and the risk of how you couch risk, I think, is really interesting, because there's risk involved in this event. It's a high risk event in that you spend a lot of time, a block of training, 3 or 4 months typically, working towards one race. And then there are lots of things that need to line up perfectly for that race to be optimum for you. So you need things that are beyond your control and things that are in your control to go well. So you need the weather to be good. You need to have chosen a good course. You need to know that, I don't know, the things that are in your control, that you've got your nutrition right, that you've got your in-race fueling right, most crucially that you have paced it correctly and that you've learned from previous experiences how to pace it correctly. You've used the data available to you to understand how to pace the race correctly. All of these things add up. And there's certain things that are going to be, other things that are outside of your control, like you haven't had an accident the previous week. One of my very good friends, who's a very good marathon runner, the week before London, which is the London Marathon's just happened, he got stabbed in the ribs with an umbrella, which then they went into running London with a cracked rib. Not ideal, and nothing they could have done about it. It's like you're going to have like these things that are beyond your control, where you have a certain element of luck.
I'm so pleased it finished with an umbrella, because I was just like, what? Like, this sounds horrific.
It's so...
Still doesn't sound great. But
I think how you catch these things, we talk about control the controllables. There are going to be certain things that you can control and certain things that you can't. So you can't control the weather, but what you can control is, have you worn the right kit? Have you responded correctly in terms of, modifying nutrition, hydration? And have you got your head around the fact that maybe it's going to be a hot day or a windy day, and not let it upset you? Because what's the point? So understanding that and how you couch that is really crucial. And I guess there's a types of risk, like how do you get the most from yourself in a training block? Because you're often only going to know that you've kind of reached your limit when it's too late. So you want to get the most from your training. You want to be pushing yourself as hard as you can within the boundary of not hurting yourself. And sometimes you only know that you've hit it when you hit it and you get injured. So, there's this kind of risk, reward, control dynamic that's really fascinating.
And back to your asking why questions earlier, I'm going to do the same to you. I'm like, I struggle with, and I get this picture. So I look at it and go, like, I don't think I can. Frankly, I'm too lazy to even try and run a marathon. I just go, that's ridiculous. Why would anyone want to do that? And I find it hilarious that we've got this, why is it called the marathon? Well, it was a long, long time ago. There is a story. We don't know whether that's true or not, that someone ran this distance, blah, 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 blah. And so there's a story behind the thing, back to storytelling. But like, I look at that and go, why would anyone do that? It strikes me as being insane. But then I go, well, there's other things I do that other people go, that's insane. Why would you do that? Right. So I sort of get horses for courses. But what is it? What possesses you to go into coaching?
Interesting. I mean, I think it is relating to. I'm ridiculously helpful. That's what it is, Christian. I'm absolutely incredibly helpful.
No, I reminded me of those job interviews where you get people going, "What's your biggest weakness?" And people go, my attention to detail. I love that. Right, your weakness is I'm ridiculously helpful.
I'm far too helpful for my own good.
Yeah.
So
Right.
if I can see that somebody, could could use a hand and that my experience could be valuable to them, then I find that hard to resist. But I think I'm fascinated by the human psychology of this particularly, as I say, particularly acute event of this is something where it's high risk stakes and you are pushing yourself to the limit. It's got this fascination attached to it because it is so hard to do. And I can see people, around me at my training group who really want to understand how to do that best. And I think there's been a lack of holistic thinking in coaching. So there's a lot of old school coaches around who come from a sort of traditional athletics background and are typically men who have come through the ranks of running clubs. And there's a real shortage, as there are in most sports, of women who bring a potentially different. There are men who can do this too, but there's a way of thinking that I think is feminized that starts with the individual and thinks quite holistically about how do we get the best from people that goes beyond just understanding the numbers and the right way of doing it and actually individualizes it with understanding the human that's at the heart of what we're trying to achieve, how to get the best from them.
So in other words, if we were to loop back cunningly to the earlier conversation, this isn't just a data question, right? So it's not just about the plans and the nutrition and whatever. And of course, this is a really good illustration, I think, of the data that we have available to us now about what our bodies are doing, and the analysts, through wearables and those sorts of things. We've
Yeah.
got there's a lot more of that data. So I guess what you're bringing in is what you were talking about in your work, right? Is this we need to understand the human side of it and bring that piece into the data is incredibly helpful, right?
Yeah.
Let's start with we need to know what time we've run the thing in, right? That would be
Yeah.
good. But then
Yes.
there's weather data, all these other things. But you're basically saying, okay, for that to be useful, I then need to understand the human that's there. And I guess
Yeah.
so this is an interesting thing where I guess a lot of this is mind over matter as well, right? This isn't just a case of
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
just a
Yeah.
case
Yeah.
of sort of what you should theoretically. And I think there's an interesting parallel there with sort of what people ought to do. Well, you
Yeah.
ought to be performing like this. Well, we're not robots,
Yeah.
right? And so there's other things at play, and so that's really the bit that you're taking. And I guess taking from your own experience of having done it and your own passion for it,
Yeah.
you've got. I mean, my view of marathons, you've got to be passionate about it to do more than one.
Oh my
Right? I can
gosh.
see people do
Yeah.
one as a thing.
Yeah.
Like,
Totally.
not so you just sort of rock up and have a crap. How hard can that be? Right, really, is my
It's
sense.
really hard.
But so you're really bringing some of that understanding the human that's behind it, and so this is entirely relevant to your work, really.
It is. So a couple of things that I'd just like to bring out there. I think that some people that I coach come to me directly and say, yes, please, I really would like you to help me. Let's have a call. Yeah, I'd love you to write me a plan. Other people I have to kind of approach by stealth. So young lads. I've got a young lads training group who I think one of the best things that I could do for them is to bring them together. And that's true of everybody. So there's a huge element of the training groups that I run that is about belonging and connection. And when people come together to train together or to do anything together, but this particularly works in this context, they learn from each other. They boost, motivate, inspire each other. With my lads, one of them will run a 35-minute 10K, and that gives the others who've been training with them and keeping up with them the motivation that, of course, I'm going to go do that now because Fred's just done it, so that's fine. I'm going to do that. That's well within my wheelhouse too. And that kind of working together, seeing from each other, learning from each other has huge power. And I don't have the ego that I think they all need to think that they're doing it because I've told them to. I think by me facilitating that kind of belonging, there's an enormous amount of value in the power of a training group and people coming together and really having that motivation. And the other thing is, yes, absolutely, psychology. There's that, thinking fast, thinking slow, Daniel Kahneman thinking, where it's about the system 1, system 2 of the brain. That is particularly relevant for marathon running. So there's a sports psychologist called Steve Peters who's written a book called The Chimp Paradox, which I absolutely love. I think it goes well beyond sport, but it's about how you can use you can think about different parts of your brain. You've got the system 1, quick thinking, which is there for a very strong reason. It's there to protect you. He personifies that as being the chimp. And then you've got your system 2, which is the human, the sort of rational part of your brain that is slower to think and to come to the fore. And then you've got your computer where you're putting in the automated behaviors and the habits. I think there's a huge amount of really fascinating psychology around that. And if people aren't familiar with Steve Peters, I would really recommend looking him up. He's worked with all sorts of very prominent sports people. He worked with Sky cycling team, he's worked with Ronnie O'Sullivan, Premiership football teams. But when your chimp is a really important part of your psyche, but it's not always helpful, which is why it's called The Paradox, this book. And you need your chimp to protect you. You need your chimp to be going, there's a danger, like, here's how to respond. But sometimes that response isn't very helpful. So it might be someone cuts you up in traffic and you get angry. That's your chimp. Your chimp's angry because somebody's encroached on your territory. It's a very primitive response. And we need to help our human to deal with our chimp, handle our chimp, understand how to calm the chimp down, because it's not going to help you then to, like, butt up against that driver and to get road rage about it. That's a dangerous situation. The chimp wants to do it. The chimp's cross. In a marathon, your chimp, it's like everything in your chimp is going, why are you doing this? It's insane. It's trying to protect you. It's trying to stop you. At the beginning, it's asking you questions. It's got these nagging doubts. It's trying to take control of you not doing something where you're pushing yourself to the physical and mental limit. And then later on, it's those doubts become really vivid and poignant, and the voice is very loud saying, you need to stop now. And it takes a lot to manage the chimp and help to understand how to quieten that voice and how to help your human to deal with the chimp and to push through and to say, I am going to do this. This is the challenge that I've set myself up for, and it's okay. We can get through it. It's a really hard thing to achieve, but I think that's kind of ultimately the psychology that we need to get hold of.
So that makes me smile, because I have seen that book in typical travel book shows, airports and train stations, right? It sits there alongside that. There's a series by a guy called Thomas Erickson, I think, called Surrounded by Idiots,
Yes.
which has been massively discredited. And I've seen that, and it sits alongside sort of other motivational nonsense. And so I've always looked at both. Oh, that looks interesting. I'm like, no, it's in the what I politely describe bollocks section. So I'm not going to read it. And so I will now read it.
Yeah,
So
it's actually, and it is founded on, really solid neuroscience and good stuff. Yeah, behavioural economics, actually. So
good. Okay, well, I will check that out. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Before I let you go, you mentioned earlier about Speak to the Human, which is your annual event, and that's how we originally met. And I loved it so much that I'm coming back as an attendee.
I'm so excited that you're coming back.
I'm thrilled, because it was just one of those things. And I want to talk to you about the curation and how you think of it. And we've had, just for listeners, there's a couple of guests on the show that came as a result of my attendance there.
I'm so pleased that you've done that.
And so just give us a sense, because it was an event unlike any other, and it was a very human event. Yeah. And, there is no shortage of events that are not designed for humans, that are dull, that contain no sense of anything, sort of the brutally, in hideous venues with brutally efficient delivery mechanisms that are not at all engaging, the kind of thing I shy away from. Yeah. But I'm interested. Talk to us a little bit about what is it, but how do you go about curating that in the spirit of it? Because it would be brand destructive for Acteon to put on an event that was inhumane, right?
Yes,
tedious and dull, right? There would be literally how to send a signal that you're not about all the things that you are actually about. But how do you go about thinking that and curating the people that you have, and maybe talk a little bit about who they are and how that works as well? But I'm fascinated by how do you take something that has every, in theory, conferences, and it's not, conference would be a bad way of describing it, but that's a sort of rough genre, if you like.
Yeah.
That there are so many things that are so crappily done. Yes. And I'm intrigued as to how you approach it to make sure that it's not crap and that it sticks to your values.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess our starting point for it was realizing that through the people we work with at Acteon, that they're often in very, very different roles. They might have different job titles or in different sectors, but there's a commonality. There are often common threads of challenges, and thinking, wouldn't it be cool if that person sat next to that person and had a conversation about it? Because, they're basically trying to deal with the same, human messiness here, and they would never have cause to meet. Let's create an event where we bring those people together and we put some amazing speakers in front of them, give a cool way of making it a comfortable day so that people relax, they are happy to be together, share, open up, feel comfortable. But also, crucially, that we step back so it doesn't feel like an Acteon sales event. And I hope,
Infomercials.
yeah, I know. I hope we have managed to achieve that. I think we have. Because, it isn't intended for that purpose. And so Speak to the Human is about how do we connect with the humans we're trying to deal with? How do we deal with? Sounds a bit clinical, doesn't it? I don't really mean that. I mean, going back to that concept that organizations are fundamentally collections of humans. How do we think about that? How do we use those behavioral drivers that I was talking about earlier? So for me, if we picked up a different theme each year, our first year was a theme around communication and storytelling. Last year, when you were our keynote speaker, we talked about disruption and change. So navigating change and harnessing disruption, with disruption being as in that can be a positive way of just looking at something differently or posing something in a different way so that people see it differently. And this year, our theme is belonging and connection, which I've been talking about a bit today. And yes, we want it to feel like something different, so that we've opened it up to go beyond a conference. We do have, I suppose, what you would describe as conventional speaking slots with the slides and the things that people expect at a conference. And that's great because I work really hard to make sure that I'm very careful and deliberate about who I'm putting in front of the room, so that I've got a kind of handle on their values, their ideas, what they want to say, what they'll bring to it. And I thought about how they fit into a kind of thread and a story arc across the day that I try to set up and curate thoughtfully. But then inject a ton of energy into the thing by doing stuff that's unconventional. So we've used music, and I know you had a recent episode where you were interviewing Heather Urquhart, who is absolutely brilliant improvisational musician. And with two colleagues, Ali and Joe, they've been at the last two events. They've just been so different. So, they will be at the front of the room. They take ideas and requests from the audience and they create improv music, injected points in the day. They've been there the last 2 years. We've actually got two different musicians this year who aren't improv musicians, so we're using that in a different way. This year we've got magicians who are so fun. I am so excited that they're coming. Fergus and Neb, they're called Talk Magic, and they use magic as a vehicle for opening up creativity and problem solving and helping people to just, they use it as a kind of workshop tool. That's really cool. We have Hannah, who you've also interviewed on the podcast, and she's awesome. She's an illustrator. So she creates an artwork through the day, listening to the speakers and creating a drawing based on the ideas that she's hearing. And she works at the back of the room, and people see it at intervals as they go out for breaks and lunch. And this evolving piece of artwork that's just stunning. And we go over to Hannah and say, hey, what have you picked up as ideas through the day? So yeah, we have those different things going on that just kind of really make it feel different. Another thing is, I think we've got a cultural and social tendency at the moment to think that growing things is important and the right thing to do. And I'm trying to keep hold of not growing this because I think deliberately keeping it small is invitation only and making sure that it retains that intimate feel. We don't live stream it. We don't even really share slides afterwards. Makes it feel very present. We don't have a hashtag even. We just want people to be present, be themselves, be in the room, put aside all their other thinking, and be there in an intimate setting where it feels safe, it feels cool, it feels energetic, and we have an awesome day. Another little, just to finish, a device that I have is a little postcard that I give everybody. And the idea is you write down 3 things that you want to remember from the day, and then you put it into a sealed envelope, self-address it. We don't record any of the addresses. People put that into a little box that we've got outside, and then 3 months later, we post the postcard back to them. So 3 months later, when mostly, if we've been to a business conference, we've forgotten pretty much everything that we thought of, even if you felt quite inspired by something, you get this postcard back. You open up the envelope and there are your own 3 ideas of things that you wanted to remember. So I hope it gives some kind of feel of longevity. just to finish, I've said that about keeping the event intimate, but what I'm trying to do is open up connection and network around it with other things that we now grow through the year. So one of those things is I started a podcast and I interviewed you as our second guest a couple of weeks ago. So we're about to publish that episode. So obviously that can reach more people. And I think I can bring in our speakers and share those ideas in a much broader way.
Love it. Love it. And I'd say what's amazing is just the infectious way that you talk about stuff, right? There's just this energy because you love what you do. And I think if there's one thing that I would want people to take away from both the way that you are as an organization, but also you as individuals, but the work that you do is this sort of like life doesn't have to be dull.
No, my goodness,
fun,
absolutely.
right? And we can do some interesting things. And I think it's, there's in this world where everything's serious, right? If it's a serious subject, it needs serious delivery and serious this.
Need some graphs.
And of course, right, I'm not suggesting that we suddenly jazz everything up. And there's some serious subjects that do require serious attention. Engineering would be a good example. But I think there is room to recognize how do we get people's attention in a world where they're easily distracted, back to the social media thing. And the answer is we've got to start recognizing how do we press buttons with people in a really good way?
Yeah.
And I think there's lots of people out there pressing negative buttons, right? Outrage and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And I think there's something quite nice just being passionate about what you do, because that is by default infectious.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to say thank you for just being you. I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on the show. It's been amazing.
Too.
I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting you. If people want to get hold of you, find out more about all the other stuff that we've talked about, where should they go?
So I guess my email we can share in the show notes. So I'm Sarah.Abramson at acteoncommunication.com, and I'm on LinkedIn as Sarah Abramson. I'm happy to share that link in show notes too.
Perfect. We'll put links to that and the Acteon website and all the other things that we talked about.
Yeah, definitely.
Looking forward to seeing you soon for Speak to the Human this year. But in the meantime, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thank you.
So that's it for this special episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Sarah for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Sarah, Acteon, Speak to the Human, and the Speak to the Human podcast, which features a rather familiar voice that you might recognize, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. You'll also find links to my discussions with two of the amazing people that I met at last year's event. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review or rating for it on whichever platform you're listening to it on, please do so. It really does help. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website at humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, enjoy speaking to the human, and thank you so much for listening.